Okay, so thank you all so much for being here. We're going to go ahead and get started. As you may have noticed, there are a few folks that are listed on the agenda that aren't here. And unfortunately, there were some last-minute conflicts that prevented some of our co-panelists from being here. And as they say, necessity is the mother of invention, and so we have sort of decided to reconceptualize the panel and just try to have more of a conversation, sort of kicking off with some of the examples around intersectionality applied and intersectionality appropriated. My name is Priscilla Ocen. I am a fellow with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and my co-panelist is Kolleen Duley. She is a PhD candidate in women's studies and also a JD candidate here at the law school, or as other folks might say, she's a bad mother, shut your mouth. That's basically what it is. That's who she is, just in case you didn't know, now you know. So we're going to go ahead and kick off the comments, and I know that there's so much knowledge in the room that we are sort of just the beginnings of it, so we're hoping to have a very rich dialogue and conversation with everybody. So I'll go ahead and hand it off to Kolleen to talk about some of the ways in which intersectionality has been appropriated to advance ends that are against the political project for which intersectionality was originated.
Awesome. Thanks, Priscilla. You always, as always, too kind. So I have a paper that I have written and pieced together from other conferences and other spaces that I've been able to think and brainstorm with other activists and scholars and, pretend lawyers. And I say that, I mean that people who are actually lawyers but use it in order to further social justice goals. So I'm just going to read a little bit and then talk a little bit and then cut as needed for time. It's about 20 minutes though. In order to address the gender-based inequalities in California's women's prisons, the Gender Responsive Strategies Commission, which is a state-sponsored coalition of scholars, women's advocates, and prison representatives, have allied to research and then implement what they call gender-conscious correctional policies. Since 2006, at the behest of feminist-identified criminologists, the California legislature has proposed bills to construct a series of female rehabilitative community, I put that in quotes, community correctional centers in order to implement these gender-specific policies and ostensibly to create a prison environment based on safety, respect, and dignity. So just to back up for a second, they're posing to create a prison environment based on safety, respect, and dignity. That could be considered a contradiction, perhaps, in some of your minds. At first glance, the logic of gender consciousness appears sound, right? Grassroots activists, critical prison studies scholars have exposed the gendered inequalities in women's prisons, and the state responds with some sort of reform. However, these efforts put forth in order to, as the literature says, better manage women offenders and to decrease the likelihood of litigation against the criminal justice system, as in fewer sexual assault cases brought forth in the media, not necessarily to actually stop sexual assault inside of prisons. Bring forth a bunch of new questions, theoretical and practical questions for socio-legal analysis, for intersectional feminist praxis, and for the possibilities of prison activism and even perhaps abolition. Unfortunately, such efforts to advance singularly gender-based reforms rely on one-dimensional notions of gender and fail to substantively address the problems associated with women's incarceration. My research suggests that, in fact, gender-responsive prisons perpetuate and expand state imprisonment apparatuses that, of course, rely upon institutionalized racism, widespread poverty, homophobia, and gendered violence to funnel millions of marginalized populations like the poor, people of color, undocumented people, sex workers, queers, violence survivors, the mentally ill, transgendered people, gender nonconforming people, and women into U.S. prison and jails. The fact that that's such a long sentence and a mouthful, I think, is also indicative. My work illustrates the harms associated with uncritical and narrow, quote-unquote, gender-responsive reforms on various planes. For example, numerous criminological studies on gender responsiveness focus on what they call women-specific criminal behavior, women-specific pathways to prison, and articulate a universal need for relationship-based therapy inside of prisons. Of course, studies also include short sections and always mentioned in the first couple sentences dedicated to triple jeopardy, as it's called, or the intersections of race, gender, and class. However, this unsubstantiated use of intersectionality, what I mean by that is that no scholars, not I mean, Kim Crenshaw for one, but then also no scholars who use the word intersectionality have been cited in most of these studies. In fact, most of the three women who do this work actually cite to all their own work in the end of this very long document that I'm about to talk about in a second. However, I argue that this unsubstantiated use of intersectionality operates as an alibi for prison expansion, because rather than deploy intersectionality to lessen prison's harm on multiply marginalized people, the literature relies on a series of shrewd and selective appropriation mechanisms which misconstrue anti-prison activist demands for prison alternatives. They reify flawed liberal feminist discourse on gender equality, i.e. for whites by whites, while simultaneously recalling and sublimating imperative intersectional analytical paradigms. That's a mouthful. By precluding a systemic analysis of the inequalities behind mass incarceration, and by expanding the prison industrial complex, gender-responsive discourse and practice ends up replicating the detrimental effects of prisons on the lives of women prisoners and their communities. Furthermore, operating within the context of the rampant expansion and consolidation of imprisonment mechanisms such as the wars on poverty, crime, drugs, terror, state-sponsored gender responsiveness efforts do in fact function as a particularly insidious, strategic, and replicable form of state hegemony in which feminists, scholars, and advocates are all implicated. With this background, then, I raise a couple questions about gender-responsive discourse and practice in the California context. How have such efforts come about, and what roles do anti-prison activists play? What role do feminists play? What role do scholars play? What are the theoretical premises upon which state-sponsored gender responsiveness rely? And what are some of the possible consequences of such identity-based boutique prisons? Finally, how might prison abolitionist strategies be better situated to address problems associated with mass incarceration? Positioning gender equality, i.e. gender responsiveness, at the forefront of women's prison reform displaces the possibility of seeing how other vectors of power order life both inside and outside of the prison. I argue that gender can be isolated in part in prison reform because of the liberal anti-violence against women movement position the state as being capable of gender responsiveness, consequently relying on the criminal justice system and social service model to address violence. Of course, that's not my argument. In fact, it's Beth Ritchie's, along with the other cadre of feminist activists who have been a part of the violence movement and also critiqued it from the inside. This state, which critique especially the turn to criminalization as a solution to violence. The state dependence signaled a consequential and ideological shift. First, the state becomes imagined as an appropriate vehicle for feminist advocacy. State-sponsored feminism becomes possible despite the inherent contradictions, perhaps, of this position. Second, because the state responded with its brand of feminism, while at the same time failing to address other axes of intersectional inequality, the state thus reaffirmed gender as an appropriately privileged site of oppression, that gender should be at the forefront of women's prison reforms. In fact, much of Western liberal feminizing still conceives of violence against women as a primarily gender-based problem, despite evidence that in imagining singularly gendered subjects, a host of subjectivities are positioned in a precarious relationship with the state. For example, in the gender-responsive literature, women's imprisonment is distinguished from men's imprisonment through intersectionality discourse in order to legitimize exceptional and singular gender reform. This move is strategic because male and trans prisoners and systemic analyses of prisons would complicate this already fragile binary upon which the gender-responsive project relies. It is important to note that it is precisely because intersectionality has entered, though inappropriately, mainstream debate that the move to create gender-responsive prisons is more than a problem of the state's failure to recognize the multiplicity and inseparability of identity formation. And it's also more than a problem of the state's failure to grasp the nuances of intersectional practice. Rather than ignoring intersectional oppression, as some feminists in this criminological field have done, gender-responsive discourse strategically deploys and then discards intersectional matrices. For example, in the book length, and I mean book length, this study is 170 pages long, sponsored by the National Institute of Corrections and also done by a small group of the same feminist-identified criminologists. For example, in this book-length study used to craft the California Gender-Responsive Master Plan, which is the plan to build, which I'll talk about in a second, 4,500 women's facilities that would be quote-unquote gender-responsive. And I kid you not, the plan is called the Gender-Responsive Master Plan. Here, women's intersectional oppression, again called triple jeopardy, explains women's unique pathways, of course, without actually explaining the ways in which intersectionality leads to or departs from prison discourse. Simply put, the front page of a truncated NIC, National Institute of Corrections handout, which is called the Gender Responsive Bulletin, proposes programming sensitive to the fact that imprisoned women are disproportionately women of color who've grown up in less than optimal family and community environments. Again, not only are the current systemic injustices associated with imprisonment erased, but perhaps as expected, the root causes of imprisonment, legacies of genocide, slavery, white supremacy, are completely and strategically kept off the table, so to speak. Instead, this patronizing programming plan is an appropriation of anti-prison activism as well as critical race and feminist literature that was explicitly designed to expose the overlapping fabrics of state power and ideology that fuel incarceration in order to prevent women's victimization. So this is a circular argument on their part. Here, gender-responsive discourse and strategies rely on feminist intersectional literature in order to reconceptualize imprisonment practices in accordance with the dramatic increase in women prisoners in recent decades. So what I mean by that is, like, within the first line of any gender responsive literature, you get women of color are disproportionately affected by incarceration. 80% of women in prison are mothers. Most women in prison are survivors of domestic violence. So it's sort of almost like, because intersectionality is so, circulates so cohesively almost in debate that it gets strategically deployed, and it's actually the opposite of what we want these discourses to do, right? To highlight the root causes of incarceration. Instead, they're just slapped on the front page, and that acts as an alibi for never actually having to contend with the fragilities that mess with a simply gender-based prison reform. So criminal justice rhetoric focuses on building new and improved prisons and revitalizing existing prisons with standardized, women-sensitive, quote-unquote, policies and programs. Some examples include relationship-based psychological treatment, where the point of that is to change the dynamic between guards and women so that they are in a different sort of relationship rather than a power-over relationship. It's supposed to be some sort of symbolic relationship, which is just, well, I just think ridiculous. Not to say that all prison guards are necessarily awful people, but to create that dynamic amidst the power-laden dynamics of a prison is just, it's atrocious to assume that could happen. Also includes training sessions where guards learn to be culturally attuned in order to become aware and accepting of cultural differences when working with someone from a different cultural background. Right? This is also assuming that all prison guards are white and all women in prison are women of color, that guards need to accept this tolerance-based diversity model, right, like we see in corporations. In the process of mobilizing intersectional discourse to authenticate the urgent need for gender-responsive prisons, the undercurrents of static and one-dimensional gender categories flow furtively. Corrections literature articulates the most pressing cause for concern. Women are essentially different from men. In fact, the reader is inundated with the statement, women commit crimes that are less violent than those committed by men. It's on every page, perhaps every other paragraph. Such discourse, women don't commit as violent crimes as men. Such discourse relies upon and reifies racialized and gendered tropes about both white women's moral superiority and the inherent violent and irredeemable nature of male prisoners, whom of course are disproportionately men of color. Here, men are demonized in an effort to save women of color or to mold them into better citizens, or more like, parentheses, good white women, which of course is rooted in the history of women's gender reform, from the 1800s, was using these, women are morally superior, so we must domesticate them in order to show them how to cook, how to clean, and how to live in, nice little cottage units where they, ostensibly become appropriate citizens. This paternalism and racism is hidden in this pathologic reliance on simplistic and antiquated norms of white femininity in order to manage maladjusted prisoners. Lori Schachter suggests that these projects are aimed at, quote, taming unruly criminalized women, read women of color. Here, the strategic appropriation and then displacement of intersectional analysis acts as a convenient alibi for the, perhaps expected, return to the safe haven of gender essentialism, located within acceptable modes of public resistance. Indeed, the belief that women prisoners can be saved because they are less violent than men is an important tagline for gender responsiveness. I argue that it signals a simultaneous departure from the more politically radical feminist analysis and from male prisoner advocacy, or prison activism in general, while it also represents a desperate clinging to legitimate state-sponsored activism. Thus, the gender-responsive camp remains on the right side of justice, where criminologists can carefully distance themselves from radicals who might not end their critiques of the prison system with a solution to build more prisons. Instead, they would challenge the incarceration machine as a whole. In the interest of time, I think that I have a short section about California's move to create gender-responsive prisons, but I think I'll just sum it up. Activists in California have long contended that women's prisons are dangerously far from women's homes, that they have terribly inadequate health care, that there's high rates of sexual assault and violence, and there's been a very strong public outcry of these problems. And so the state has allied and said, you know, like this National Institute of Corrections research study, to implement these gender-specific policies. A lot of it has been surrounded by issues and contentions with solitary confinement and male prisoners guarding female prisoners, as if essentially predicated on the idea that women guards would be less violent than men, which statistically we haven't seen. So I would argue in this question, if we position the fact that women are uniquely susceptible to sexual, physical, and emotional abuse in the security housing units, or the whole issue, thus male guards should be replaced with female ones. However, various strategies stir suspicions regarding the efficacy of singularly gender-based strategies. For example, are male, queer, femme, and transgendered prisoners in men's prisons susceptible to gendered violence? And if so, should they be protected by gender-responsive reform? Gender-responsive expansion. Look what they've done to my song, Ma. Although there is a great need to, I should sing that, but I'm a terrible singer. But maybe you get the reference. Although there is a great need to address the human rights violations in prisons at large, anti-prison activists maintain that gender-responsive state policies will not alleviate abuse. Instead, they point to the appropriation of their demands by the state in a way that expands the prison industrial complex in the guise of feminism and in the guise of gender reform. For example, upon the recommendation of a gender-responsive strategy committee, which was formed again by the state and included criminologists, scholars, and activists, the California Department of Corrections responded to activists' demands for community oversight of prisons by proposing that 4,500 non-serious, non-violent female offenders be moved into community-based prisons. The bill's author claimed that these mini-prisons would provide relationship-based behavioral therapy and other women-specific services in order to promote successful reentry into society. So in other words, this is the beginning of conversations about reentry, but again, only through this state-sponsored apparatus. The mini-prisons, of course, would be absolutely identical to existing women's prisons. No more extra time outside. There'd still be a shoe, exactly the same, except that supposedly they would have these relationship-based therapies. However, anti-prison activists note that these community facilities are not really community facilities at all, nor do they respond to prisoners' needs. They've historically been cruel and ineffective state practices. For example, the California Community Prisoner Mother Program, which a lot of us fought for, right? A lot of us, I mean, I feel like part of what I'm trying to tell you is the story of co-optation that I have also been privy to. Like, we fought for Community Prisoner Mother Program. We thought it would be a great idea. Let's let women have their children inside. However, we've seen again that those demands have been reappropriated by the state. You can look at the Community Prisoner Mother Program as something that actually removes funding from the community and securitizes what would otherwise be outside and available social services, should there be any to begin with. For example, a Justice Now advocate, which is an organization based out of Oakland, who works on healthcare inside of women's prisons, notes that because there is no commitment from the CDCR, the California Department of Corrections, to close any existing prisons, the remaining women's prisons is likely to be filled with men. Gender-responsive programming. Not only do proposals for gender-responsive prisons appropriate activist demands in order to expand prisons, but the services offered in the gender-responsive master plan also replicate violence. For example, the GRC Health Committee subcommittee proposed that women be given the choice to be sterilized in the course of delivering a baby. This particularly dangerous choice is framed and informed by the state's attempt to control marginalized people's reproductive autonomy. But given the population in question, largely women of color, and the historical subjugation of their reproduction to state genocidal practices like forced sterilization, this rhetoric raises the question, how can elective sterilization be offered to women prisoners when reproductive freedom has been so consistently denied to them? It's atrocious. It is my suspicion that those in charge of women prisoners' health care have not interrogated this virtually genocidal history. Further, it would be problematic to grant this power to the state because of the differential power dynamics between prison staff, doctors, prisoners, and prisoners. And prison health care is inherently suspect, if not determinately coercive, inside of prisons. Here, again, the privileging of gender reproduces violence and erases prisoners' experiences with other types of oppression. Much of the discourse used to legitimize gender-responsive prisons, including language about criminalization and sterilization, and projects putting forth those, is grounded in a neoliberal model, where individualism and notions of free choice reign supreme. Gender-responsive advocates might contend that sterilization does not infringe upon their bodily integrity because incarcerated women consent to the procedure. Similarly, the criminalization of minoritized people is made to appear natural because ostensibly people choose to participate in criminal activity. This conceptualization of choice effectively erases the often desperate context under which people sometimes make choices. Scholar Andy Smith, who's here, argues that this concept of choice rests on essentially individualist consumer notions of free choice that do not take into consider all of the social, economic, and political conditions that frame the so-called choices that women are forced to make. Indeed, complicated contexts inform criminalization. However, gender-responsive prisons sublimate these circumstances in suggesting that individual relationship, for example, behavioral change, can address the inequalities surrounding mass incarceration. Just a quick, I'm going to summarize this part. It's called Reform, Reform, and More Reform. It's hard to imagine that building more prisons would solve the problems with mass incarceration. And, you know, lots of scholars like Foucault, perhaps most frequently is cited as saying that, like, reform is part of the carceral mechanism. It's part and parcel of its functioning, that reforms are posited, and then prisons get better. Reforms are posited, and then prisons get better. However, the larger argument is that reform based upon reform simply makes prisons appear more acceptable and less inhumane to outside populations, when in fact the conditions inside, the inherent power dynamics, are unchanged. Prison abolitionist reforms, I'm going to end with this. Thanks for your patience. Many accept less than perfect reform in hopes that such facilities will be a method of better incarceration. It's hard to imagine that the crisis would be solved even if prisons were gender responsive, whatever that could really even mean. I think that should be up to us to decide rather than various position state parties. What types of reforms would be acceptable? I'm not saying we shouldn't have any kind of reforms in prisons. We desperately need health care. We desperately need to stop the sexual abuse of prisoners. But what kind of reforms would address prisoners' suffering yet not perpetuate these cycles of the U.S. prison system failing? Organizers from the prison abolitionist organization Critical Resistance demand that we build healthy communities, not prisons. Of course, the project demands an impossibly difficult system-wide overhaul, requiring the repeal of policies and practices that systematically deny minoritized people access to community sustainability, basic human needs, quality education, healthcare, mental health services, substance abuse treatment, living wage jobs, affordable transportation, violence prevention, methods for healing from trauma, etc., etc., etc. And these services need to be provided in a community, not in a prison. Of course, no single legal remedy or uncomplicated solution could address all of these issues, indeed, probably not even one. But prison abolitionists fight for reforms that work toward dismantling rather than expanding the scope of the prison system and related injustices. Such strategies might simply be not supporting measures that expand the carceral mechanisms, like gender-responsive prisons. Or it might be studying models for non-harmful responses to intimate partner violence, or supporting decarceration bills, getting non-violent offenders out of prison, especially because that's the language that they're trying to use anyway. Or challenging laws that impose stiff sentences on drug addicts. For example, in exposing gender-responsive prison plans, Justice Now organization asks, if the state believes that nonviolent female offenders should be released into community facilities, then why aren't these women being sent to community facilities run by the community? Or better yet, why aren't they just being released? A recent successful prison abolitionist remedy demanded that California lawmakers re-examine a compassionate release bill, which would release elder prisoners who pose the least threat to society and the largest cost to incarcerate, and they won. Another abolitionist strategy might fight to get male guards out of the SHU while advancing a political education campaign to condemn the cruel and unusual punishment inherent in all SHUs. Endless possibilities, big and small. In conclusion, abolitionist reforms, whatever articulation they may take, have at least the possibility of providing alternative visions of what healthy communities look like. They both address harm and demand a reinvestment in the community needs that keep people out of prison and jails in the first place. Thanks.
Thank you, Kolleen. What I am going to talk about is, if that is the intersectionality appropriated, what I hope to describe is intersectionality applied. And what I will describe is an ongoing process, so it is necessarily incomplete. And also necessarily from my perspective as one of the organizers of the project at the Lawyers Committee, although it is a collaborative effort that includes folks from Justice Now, from Legal Services for Prisoners with Children, California Coalition for Women Prisoners, the African American Policy Forum, and Professor Crenshaw. So there are a lot of folks that are involved in the development of this reentry project that I'm going to describe. And right now we're formulating it as a reentry project on behalf of and with formerly incarcerated Black women. And as I start my talk, I want to describe 4 women that I've met through some of my work, whose stories are often not told. And I hope that their stories will frame the rest of my comments. The first woman is named Sarah. She's 32 years old. She's a Black woman. She was sentenced to prison at age 16. Her sentence was life without parole. She was sentenced to life without parole as a juvenile for killing her pimp. She had been subject to years of sexual abuse and violence at the hands of both her mother and then later at the hands of this gentleman who took her in as who she saw as a father figure, who subsequently began to traffic her sexually. As the abuse grew, she couldn't take it anymore, obviously, and defended herself. She was brought into court. She was tried and convicted as a juvenile and sentenced, as I said, as an adult. As part of that sentencing process, she was found to be irredeemable at age 16 years old. And I met her as a 32-year-old woman at a California state prison. Now, there's more to tell about Sarah's story, but I think that those are sort of the basic facts. That's Sarah. There's also Sharon, who was sentenced to 27 years to life, also in California state prison, for killing her batterer after years of seeking help to get out of the abusive environment in which she found herself. She was separated from her children, who were placed into foster care, and she lost rights to her children. Both of these women came from large urban communities which had been basically evacuated by the government, by social services, where there were a lack of access to basic needs to employment. I also want to mention Danielle, who is a sexual abuse survivor, had much trauma in her life. She turned to drugs to deal with it. She engaged in a series of petty thefts, things like that, to support her habit. Accumulated a number of felonies over the years, was never given any help to deal with the root issues of her addiction, which is a health issue, to deal with any of the trauma. After her most recent offense, which was she was convicted of a identification theft charge, which was a felony. She got 50 years to life for her third strike. Again, she was a single mother, a drug addict, subject to sexual abuse, trauma, 50 years to life. I met her as a 50-year-old. The last woman is Deborah. She was also incarcerated for a drug offense, although she, of the women that I'm describing, has the shortest sentence. She was sentenced to 36 months in prison for drug distribution. She was from the Los Angeles area, was undereducated, underemployed, couldn't find a job, turned to the most vibrant economy in her community, which was drug distribution. Was caught, sentenced to 36 months. While she was in jail, she suffered from a series of physical illnesses, which went undiagnosed for at least the first 12 months that she was there. She was ultimately diagnosed with lupus eventually, which she thought, was a good thing until she was misprescribed medication that made her illness increasingly worse to the point where she almost lost her life. These are 4 women. They're all black women whose stories are often not told when we think about mass incarceration, when we think about the social dynamics that lead to incarceration, which Kolleen was discussing. We often focus just on the sentencing aspects or what the conditions are in jail or what happens to people outside of jail. But those social dynamics, the intersectional subordination that these women experience prior to even contacting the criminal justice system were just as important as the racial and gender dynamics of the criminal and justice system. But when we talk about mass incarceration, and when we talk about, and on those occasions where we even talk about women, these women aren't raised as compelling figures for why we need reform. Instead, I've handed out a cover of a magazine, Glamour magazine, asking, does this woman deserve to be in prison? This is an image of a white woman, and the story, it's a very long story. It goes on to talk about her how she presents physically. It talks about her economic state, her education, etc., and asks the question, does this woman deserve to be in prison? And sort of elevating this woman as the example and positing the question with respect to her, that suggests that there are other women who deserve to be in prison. And these 4 women who I've described, I would submit, would be the women that, based on this question, the answer would be yes, they do deserve to be in prison. And so as I was having these conversations with these 4 women and others like them, as I was looking at the terrain in terms of the legal interventions and the popular discourse around mass incarceration, I began to see, and as others have seen, and I'm certainly new to this, but other folks have been studying this for much longer, again, how black women continue to fall into the void. And the issues that they confront both inside and outside of prison are not properly addressed because of this void in which they exist. So what we at the Lawyers Committee with other folks decided to do was to look at how can we uncover and uplift these 4 women, their stories, their children, and how can we design particular remedies based on their experiences, based on their stories, based on what is most relevant to their communities and to our communities. And as we're having these conversations, I gave a talk yesterday and I described some of the resistance the patriarchy that emerged in terms of who's most important to our community, in terms of how do we direct our efforts, and why are we focusing on black women, and sort of wrestling with some of those issues. But we decided to really focus on black women because we didn't see it as an either or as a zero-sum game, but we saw it as looking to the bottom. As all of the other conversations have been during this symposium, it's looking to the bottom to find the best solutions to these critical issues impacting the black community, particularly in San Francisco, which is, as I said, which is under assault in numerous ways. The population is down to 7%, but yet in our jails, black women represent up to 40%. In our prisons, black women represent up to 50%. Although they only represent 13% of the population in the state of California. And as we began to conceptualize this project, we knew it couldn't be something that came from the Lawyers Committee or from the nonprofit community. It had to be something rooted, as I said, in these lived experiences. So in addition to talking with women, we began to pull together what we saw as, what we described as a learning circle. There was an interdisciplinary group of black women that was convened in August of last year. There were women from the Academy, Professor Crenshaw, folks from Bolt, who have been working on these issues and have done groundbreaking studies on the employment discrimination facing formerly incarcerated black women, the first of its kind, very recently in 2009, that found that black women, unsurprisingly, were the most disadvantaged when it comes to seeking employment after being incarcerated. And interestingly, that the criminal conviction was being used as a proxy, so that black women, whether incarcerated or not, or formerly incarcerated or not, had equal chances at these entry-level positions. So we were bringing together folks who were formerly incarcerated, worked with in behalf of folks who were formerly incarcerated. We were working with folks who were, like Justice Now, who are working on issues around reproductive health in prisons and asking questions about how are black women particularly impacted in the areas in which we work. And for many of us, it was the first time that question had been asked, or the first time they had really thought about it in really deep detail. And so we all sort of came together and began to talk about how we can strategize the areas in which we can focus. So these learning circles, this first planning of these learning circles was really formative of the project. And we've looked, since we've initially had these discussions, we've looked at reproductive rights, which Kolleen was talking about, and some of the presentations that we received from both incarcerated women, formerly incarcerated women, from folks like Justice Now, have been talking about the ongoing issues around sterilization, the ongoing issues around shackling, the ongoing issues around depriving, especially black women, of the right to see their children. And all of these issues that I've mentioned are impacting especially black women. And all of the work that's being done has documented the ways in which this is happening. So we've been collecting this data. We've talked about the right to family and family unification. And we've also gotten pushback from folks around how we were talking about how we were conceptualizing our own ideas. So it was a very dynamic process that really challenged our basic assumptions around incarceration and what was going on. So there's reproductive rights and right to family unification. There was housing, mental health, and employment. These are some of the areas that we focused on. And out of these conversations, we've begun to build specific interventions. So one of the first things that we've done in San Francisco is we found out that there are gaps in services. One of the areas that we're looking at, one of the strategies that we're adopting in terms of minimizing or collapsing the prison industrial complex is making sure that women don't go back. That's one of the steps, is making sure that women don't go back to prison. And one of the areas that we found is that with respect to black women, there are barriers to access to critical services, barriers to access to critical legal services, especially around their families, especially when women are taken out of their communities. Black women, and the black women that we're focusing on, are heads of households. So when they are incarcerated, their children are either placed with family members and increasingly placed in foster care. As I mentioned yesterday, 2/3 of the children in San Francisco's foster care system are African American. Again, we're only 7% of the population, but 2/3 of the kids are African American, and many of them are there because their mothers are incarcerated. So we were looking at how can we provide good representation to these women to get their kids back, or to make sure they never lose their kids in the first place. So we're now designing legal projects to connect with women before they lose their kids. We're also looking at providing other services in small areas that we traditionally don't think of that are important in terms of how do you deal with restitutions, fines, et cetera. These are small things that the women that we've been working with have constantly told us are issues for them when they come out of prison. Where am I going to live? But there are barriers that come up even before you can get to a place to find secure housing that often go unaddressed and that lead to women going back to prison. So we're designing legal services to address some of the barriers that black women are confronting. We're also pushing some of our allies to look at, when we're doing some of our work, let's say around employment, how are we targeting those areas where black women are disproportionately represented? How are we looking at how we can address some of the discriminatory aspects and discriminatory barriers facing formerly incarcerated black women in particular? So these are some of the ways in which we have used the outcomes of the learning circles to better inform our advocacy by looking in a nuanced, complicated, intersectional fashion around the dynamics impacting black women. Now, as we talked about this, it was also important for us to lay things on the table like patriarchy, to talk about the social dynamics and the ways in which black women are racialized that lead to these outcomes. Like when judges look at black women and they see that there's someone who has a drug problem. Are they seeing someone with a health issue, or are they seeing someone who is, again, socially deviant? Again, all these sort of racial dynamics that come about, and the gendered aspects of those racial dynamics that come about in our criminal justice system. When we saw it wasn't enough for us just to talk about legal interventions, but we also had to do consciousness raising, not only in our legal system, but also in our own communities where women were coming back home. So we've been developing out of these learning circles, learning tools that our allies can use when we're going out and talking to folks in communities. Again, the very places where we got pushback about why are we focusing on our mothers, who have been at the front line of uplifting our communities in the face of extreme assault and deterioration. Why are we focusing on our mothers? Why are we focusing on our daughters? Why are we focusing on black women? Now, this is the critical question that we've had to deal with and contend with in our communities in terms of getting support for these projects. And so developing some of these public outreach materials based on the outcomes of the learning circles has been important and critical. Now, as I said at the beginning of my remarks, the learning circles and the Black Women's Reentry Project is in its infancy. We're still developing it. And I am interested to hear you all's thoughts. As I said at the beginning, we are hoping to facilitate this as a conversation. And we're not here having a conversation to have a conversation. We're having a conversation to move the ball forward with respect to the issues impacting women of color, and in particular in the area that I'm working on, in the area of mass incarceration. So I'm really interested to hear some of your thoughts about how this process can work better, how we can collaborate in a fashion that is powerful and that is impactful here in the state of California, in San Francisco, and nationally. So I appreciate you all being here, and I hope that we can have a really engaging conversation. Thank you. So,
do you have any thoughts, questions?
Questions?
I can tell you. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I know I'm the film person, but I have a
Go and stand in front of the camera.
Yeah, I know, that's why that's why I'm being behind. Actually, my question is, and we kind of talked about it a little bit in the hallways, but I do parole defense, and one of the things that I'm really interested in is how these issues that you're talking about come into the arena of parole. Because from my understanding, and just from what I see, one of the highest rates of the prison population is because of parole violations, and because of this whole system of parole. So could you maybe talk a little bit about that if you do?
Sure. Parole violence, that's actually an issue that was raised for us. And for those who don't know, California is actually one of I think a few states that in most cases, or I think it's automatic, or it has been automatic, places folks on parole upon exit from state institutions. Not everybody does that, and they place certain conditions on folks when they're on parole. There's one of the biggest issues is that folks are subject to no search clauses, so they can be stopped by any law enforcement search without any sort of probable cause. They have very little autonomy when it comes to sort of basic life decisions. But some of the other issues that come up with parole violations is at times there are issues around who you can associate with, job requirements. And as I've described, some of the barriers that women face, or folks generally coming out of prison, but especially but some of the folks that we're working with, some of these sort of basic things like access to employment, and then I'm talking about some of the discrimination that I was mentioning that these studies have found. If women are coming out of prison, not only are they confronting issues related to race, gender, class, being undereducated and not educated at all while incarcerated, having lacking access to basic resources that can help make them more competitive in the job market, and in addition to the fact that they're dealing with all this discrimination as a result of all these overlapping categories that I mentioned, that's a real issue in terms of being able to enforce anti-discrimination in these areas, which is very, very difficult. And in the area of licensing, which was one area where a lot of women go into, women often go through these programs. They pay for them. There's a whole cottage industry around licensing. So women pay to go through these programs. They're even federally backed loans. They go through these programs, take on enormous debt. They go through them, they take the licensing exam, and then they're told they can't get the license because they have a felony conviction. I know the ACLU Women's Rights Project has been working on this issue. That's huge, and it impacts the conditions of parole. And again, the association, who you can associate with, is also huge. And because of law enforcement's saturation of the communities in which they live, it's almost you can't go 2 blocks without bumping into a police officer who will stop you, ask you what you're doing. So the occupation of communities makes it almost automatic that women will return in short order once they're released. So parole is huge, and I don't have an answer. Like I said, a lot of this stuff is sort of still ongoing, and we're still just gathering some of the information, but it's a huge issue. One of the good things that's happening, it's a good and bad thing, is there's now non-revocable parole. But at the same time, that also means that women don't get access to services that they need to deal with the trauma that they've experienced both before prison and after, and during prison especially. So there are a lot of things that are going on with the supervision of folks once they're released that contributes to folks going back to jail or prison. And I don't have an answer, but those are just some of the areas that we've come across.
I don't have any answers. Oh, go ahead, Professor Ritchie.
Sorry, you can finish.
No, it's okay.
I don't
go
know
ahead.
the answers. Is good. So this may be somewhat of a naive question, but it's occurred to me that in part what we need to figure out how to do is to be kind of critical of ourselves and people who we thought of as our allies. And that's part of what is concerning about the gender responsive state-sanctioned apparatus for me. And what I've wondered is, have we, I mean, I know I haven't, so I guess you or anyone else found a way to try to have a dialogue, a critical dialogue with, I mean, the good news is it's a relatively small group of self-identified, I like your terminology.
That's the only way I can think of saying it. How else was I going to say it,
Good. Self-identified feminist criminologists who are driving this machine. A lot of people, I think, are signing on and wanting a ticket on the train, but it's a small group, and I've wondered, has there been a critical dialogue that anybody knows about with the architects, about the maybe unintended consequences or,
Well, a couple thoughts, I guess, on that. The first is on the group, the cadre in and of themselves. So the Gender Responsive Strategies Commission is like 60 people-ish, maybe. But you're right in that it's, 4 or 5 feminist criminologists, who shall not be named, who, or can be, if you want to know. I have published, well, whatever, I'll tell you if you want to know. And the reason I'm not saying so is in answer to your question, because the dialogues that we have had have been not so great. So, for instance, I gave a paper, not unlike this one I just gave, at the Women's Prison Symposium at the UCLA Women's Law Journal last year, and one of the architects was in the room, and I was very aware she was going to be there, so I was thinking a lot about how to stage this in order to have a productive conversation and not sound like I'm trying to attack her. But yeah, she hollered out like right in the middle of my presentation, and she was like, "Yeah, that's me. Yeah, I did that," or something like that. And I was just like, "Wow!" And then like my advisor was right there, so I was like, "Okay, how am I gonna handle this?" I think I said something that was okay. I heard it was okay. I don't remember it, to be honest. But so in short, but like anything, there's both. Like so they've invited me. This was before I think they knew that I was critical of it, to the meeting. So I went to a couple of the meetings, and the woman who takes care of the administrative stuff was like, "Yeah, I'll send you the notes, no problem." And that's how I had the corroboration about the sterilization. And that's, you know what I mean? So like that was very dangerous for them to have done that. I don't believe they would in retrospect have done it again. But yeah, the conversations have been pretty intense. I'm trying to have those conversations, like part of like my political project is for me to have those conversations with those mostly white women, psychologists, criminologists, PhD kind of folks. But yeah, the reception is not good. And my delivery sometimes isn't good. You know what I mean? Because I'm angry about it. I think it's a shrewd appropriation of feminism that's just not productive and not fair. But the other thing I was going to say was that this is a model taken from Canada. And that's something I can't corroborate really well yet. I have 2 books that have yet to be read, but the first year of law school is like a tornado. So I haven't read anything except for cases. But yeah, it's a model straight lifted from Canada. And the Elizabeth Fry Association, which is a huge like women's organization that does a lot of stuff around exposing incarceration, at first, like many of us, signed on to this plan, and a lot of that was around like Native women's healing circles. So it was like states were, catching on to this boutique prison cottage industry, and to use your term, Priscilla, and it failed. And then a lot of these criminologists went to these national Canada studies meetings, and just it's like lifted the parts they liked and just left the parts that didn't work. It's like my undergrad papers where I'd read a book and take the parts that I like and I don't worry about the rest. And then the other example is Massachusetts, which did pass gender responsive prisons, and I have a couple contacts there when I get back into reading that I hope to be able to connect with, who were at the CR10 conference actually. Yeah. Critical Resistance 10-year anniversary conference in Oakland last year, or the year before.
Well, I think your critique is, there's lots of people who would support it. I think it's very smart and fair, and you're very brave to be engaging in it.
I'm trying to. I probably won't get a job because of it, but...
Or you get a job somewhere else.
But I'll get a job somewhere else. I don't want to work with them anyway. But yeah, thank you, Professor Ritchie.
Are there any other... Yes?
I'm wondering if it makes a difference if we think about, instead of thinking about this as like a law that got passed because people wanted to have justice, wanted to make the community say blah, 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 and these were unintended consequences. That's one way to think about it. Or if we think about these were the exact intended consequences, maybe I missed it, that's what you were saying, but it certainly seems like the intended consequences, and it certainly seems quite genocidal.
I absolutely agree with you. And
I'm wondering how can we put that out there in a way that, I keep going back to this talk that Arditi did about reframing the affective frame and making it so that everybody recognizes the injustice of this. People who are putting these bad laws into practice may not be the ones who really are going to be responsive, but it's a lot of what people talk about in this conference is community.
Yeah.
And so maybe expanding the community awareness of this rank, horrible injustice and getting an effective response.
I mean, I think it's an insidious tool of state hegemony because it's divide and conquer. It's age old, right? Like, let's get the white feminists on board, and then let's pull some rank and file legislatures, and it's divisive. And I'll tell you something. I have a lot of allies who taught me everything I know, and took care of me and helped to build my political consciousness, who are part of that. And what they say is, we're desperate. We're going to try anything now, But I would say that that's what makes it particularly insidious, that it brings everybody on board, I mean, and I also have argued, I've been critiqued heavily for just sounding like a radical activist and not substantiating anything, but and my best friend actually switched the role of my paper because the first beginning of my paper was like, bad, this is awful, sounding just crazy activist without, the substantiation. So I think maybe that switching the order of my presentation is maybe helpful, because it's sterilization, offering sterilization to women in prison. Who in the hell doesn't know that history? And if you don't know that, why? And here's a great time to start talking about it. TT.
Well, that one is really curious to me because in a way it's also an unwitting implication of sexual violence within the prison system, right? I mean, where are they going to have sex and get pregnant? I mean, what if they're on lockdown? So, right? So what is this forced sterilization do, particularly if the sentences are such a extreme sentences that they're not going to get out anytime soon. So I feel like there are potentials to recollect their own discourse and really reveal some of the systemic things that are happening in there and just occur. What in the world are they sterilizing?
And then,
Well, let me comment on this issue. I think on the two comments that were raised, Lorraine and TT. Tina. I was like TT.
I'm sorry, honey.
Well, it could be your name. I don't know. I just heard what. Okay, well, if it's Tina, the two comments about whether these policies are intended to produce this result, I think is not the point. Is not the right question. The question is, are these consequences foreseeable? And they are. The way in which Black women have been controlled through the welfare system, the welfare state, and I think that it's shifting to this mass incarceration state, the state of mass incarceration for poor Black women, and it's foreseeable. Whether it's intentional or not, it's foreseeable. And so now Black women... Absolutely. So now Black women are being placed in these institutions where they are subject to a host of arrangements, subject to sexual violence, subject to additional trauma, where they have been traumatized their entire lives that led them to be incarcerated. So the question is, should they be incarcerated in the first place? So we shouldn't be doing gender-responsive prisons. We shouldn't be doing prisons at all with respect to the issues that lead Black women to incarceration. The issues around sterilization, many of the women don't even know they've been sterilized.
No.
Okay, so let's just be clear about that. They don't even know they've been sterilized. The second is, can you get informed consent in a coercive institution? No. So they're part of the conversation that we've had through some of the learning circles is around sterilization and shackling. And there is a bill that has been attempted to be introduced, and it's interesting who gets audiences and who doesn't with respect to policymakers. There was an attempt to introduce a bill to outright ban sterilization, in the practice of sterilization in prisons. And that bill did not go anywhere. There were some concerns from both progressive communities around the language, but in general, the principle didn't go anywhere. But this bill around gender-responsive prisons got introduced. Couldn't even get authored. This bill couldn't get authored. The bill around banning sterilization in prisons couldn't get an author. but the bill around gender-responsive prisons could, because of this co-optation, it could. But when you bring up the history of race and gender, eugenics, all of these issues, people back off. And it's just a really interesting dynamic that occurs in terms of the policy making. So there's a whole advocacy project going on around sterilization in California prisons, and this is a huge issue. And again, as I mentioned during sort of my remarks, there's documented. I mean, it's not as if we don't know this. We know what's going on. But again, who gets an audience is very much about these hierarchies. And so it's not insignificant that white feminists are getting an audience with legislators. And women of color who are coming forward with these issues around shackling and sterilization are not. So I just think it's interesting, and I think we really shouldn't be focusing on what folks are intending, because then that gets into a whole other conversation. But what are the consequences of what you're intending?
That's based in law, right? That's law. I'm just learning about law, by the way. And that's a question because that's how issues around law are presented. The question is, you have to show that the state, for example, intended to discriminate. That's very hard to prove, that the state has intended to discriminate against a people, right? And that's why I think sometimes, you know, I didn't hedge, and then I got told I had to hedge, basically, around saying intentional, this is hegemony, this is particularly insidious, this is the way that hegemony works its way into the thinking of the oppressed also, right? So I really think that, because you're changing it to say, are the consequences foreseeable, which is exactly the same as saying that it's intended, right? It's exactly the same. If you saw, I mean, not in the eyes of the law, but it gives you a better basis from which to challenge.
Right, I get what you're saying. It's kind of the legal framework.
Yeah,
Requires
it
you
is.
to say
It's law.
unforeseen consequences rather than intentional.
Yeah.
Well, no,
I don't know it's intentional.
well, we could get into a conversation about how you could challenge some of these issues and the limitations of the doctrinal questions around race and gender, and I think the whole conference has been around that. What and the strategy that the Lawyers Committee is pursuing is precisely because of the way in which the law is hostile to claims that black women might make around issues around employment or what's going on in prisons around shackling, et cetera. So, for example, yesterday I mentioned a case that was decided. I think it's a case, again, that the ACLU worked on around shackling. It was a case decided, I think it was the 8th Circuit, a case called Nelson versus Correctional Medical Services, which is a private entity, I think, Correctional Medical Services Corporation. It's a private entity that works inside of prisons. That's probably one of the worst actors nationally in terms of providing inadequate health care. But anyway, the plaintiff in this case was bringing an 8th Amendment challenge, and basically the issue is was the woman provided not just inadequate, but health care that I'm trying to remember the legal standard here. It's what is 8th Amendment? It's below
Cruel
basic
and
standards, not cruel and unusual, but there are basic standards of decency, and it's sort of a recklessness sort of standard. Deliberate indifference, that's right. Whether whether the providers of the medical services were deliberately indifferent to the woman's health needs. So in sort of describing the plaintiff, this woman, Ms. Nelson, her race was not discussed at all. She's a black woman, which subjected her to being shackled. If she was a white woman, she probably would not have been shackled, but she was a black woman. But nowhere in the court's recitation of the facts was it mentioned that she was a black woman. So you can see sort of doctrinally the space, if we wanted to carve out space to talk about the race, gender dynamics that subjects women to being violated in these hosts of different ways, the space simply isn't there. Now, and I also work for a judge. I did a clerkship, and writing the fact, just stating the narrative of a case is just as important as how you resolve the case. Now, I don't know, again, whether this person did this deliberately to erase the identity of the woman who was shackled. sort of beside the point, but what the result is that it takes away the space to articulate what is actually happening with women of color in correctional institutions, and can facilitate, again, and embolden these conversations around gender-responsive prisons, because we don't have the space to talk about race in these spaces. So, you know, doctrinally, that's a problem. So where we've been focusing, and I think it's on some of it goes to the point that you're raising, Lorraine, is consciousness raising on one hand in our communities and around and with other advocates that do this work, who are well-intended, but often don't have the right analytical framework.
Yes.
And so that's really what we've been trying to do with the learning circles, is how do we create the right analytical framework so that when people are doing their work, they're affecting the change that needs to happen, instead of being counterproductive and working at cross purposes. So that's part of what we've been trying to do, and also leveraging legal resources to help women directly. Because going to court in some of these big impact litigation sort of models often doesn't produce the type of change that we would need, particularly around women of color. And I don't know, we have some folks in the room that are also experts, that do a lot of work in these areas, so I don't know if you want to add anything. But those are just some of my comments, I guess, on the questions that were previously raised. Any other questions? Yes.
And I just had a question about the other woman on the other.
Oh, yes. You know what I didn't even talk about? This is Kimba Smith. This is another case that was sort of a high-profile case. Now, the Glamour magazine, I think, is probably more indicative, but this is another high-profile case about how the minimum sentencing schemes have gone awry, particularly with respect to black women. Now, Kimba Smith was convicted of a drug trafficking conspiracy conviction. And for a lot of women, when you're involved in conspiracy, it's a particular type of criminal, there's a certain set of facts that have to be there to be involved in a conspiracy. And anybody can really, I mean, conspiracy is a very low threshold in terms of who can be convicted. You don't have to have knowledge of what's going on in terms of the larger conspiracy. You just have to be sort of somewhat involved in sort of a chain link of what's going on, and you can be held responsible for what this, the kingpin is doing, even if you're a low-level distributor, or you're, carrying drugs from one person to another. And a lot of women who have partners that are involved in the drug trade, who may do things that are incidental to advancing their partner's participation in the drug trade, like Kimba Smith, are sentenced as if they are heavy into the drug trade, and they don't have information. There are also things in the federal sentencing guidelines that allow you to reduce your sentence if you provide substantial assistance to the government in getting whoever the big kingpin is. So women who are some very tangentially involved in drug trafficking or the drug trade don't have information to give up. So they get sentenced to these huge sentences, these long sentences, like Kimba Smith was. And so she was sort of elevated as indicative or representative of this dynamic. And so what we were trying to do, and I'm sorry I didn't sort of reference this, but this is one of the stories. This is one of the stories that needs to be really talked about and elevated. But even this is problematic, because you can see the way in which he's represented. Who deserves to be in prison? She went to Hampton. She's educated. She came from a good family. She don't deserve to be in jail either. So this is also another problem that complicates the analysis. So it's not just race and gender, it's also class.
Oh, yeah.
So there are a whole host of other women who are, those are those welfare queens. Those are other women who are bad women who deserve to be in jail. But Kimba Smith, she's one of the good black folks who don't deserve to be in jail. So let's focus on her as sort of the politics of respectability when we're talking about advocacy, and this is also something we need to be avoiding. So that's Kimba Smith. And there was a. Oh yeah, I think we're out of time. I think it's almost time for the keynote. Okay. Well, thank you all so much
Thanks so much for coming and for the great feedback.